Hi, environmental sociology students. I hope you are doing well. I know it's a stressful time of the semester, but you do not have much further to go. So push a little harder and you'll get over the finish line. I am checking in with you for a couple of reasons. One, I want to tell you, each of you, that I have thoroughly enjoyed having you in this class. And I wish you the very best for whatever comes after this semester. I hope that you get a little restorative time to feel good and to then be ready to take on whatever you have to take on in your life. So, for those of you who are graduating, congratulations. For those of you who are returning next year to Wayne State, I hope that I get to see you face to face would be wonderful. Um, the second reason that I'm checking in with you is I want to highlight a few things about the final to help you be as prepared as you can be. I have been taking some notes of our progress as a class the since we since the midterm and spring break, and so that goes back to week 10. I will highlight some of those things, and then I'll say goodbye to you. To do that, I am going to share my screen with you. So let's see here. Sorry. Yeah. So here we are in the course and Canvas. This is where we started week 10. And one of the concepts that I wanted um, to address was climate refugees and the theory or perspective of population growth. I asked you to think about way back in week 10 um, that would most align with the response of climate apartheid. But before I do that, let me just go to the review page that I posted today. I've already made a couple corrections on it. I one changed this question to try to simplify it a little bit, which may um, seem a little strange to you because it still may seem a bit challenging, but it should be doable. And what I did was it asked you to think about yourself as a presenter as think about yourself as an attendee at a conference where a speaker makes a claim, and then I asked you to think about which of the three perspectives on population growth um, that that claim would be most consistent with, and then to think of a question or a counterpoint that you could offer to that speaker from one of the other two perspectives I had initially had here to address both of those other two perspectives. And I note this because there are three theories or perspectives of population growth. Just to note, I don't want you to get confused with the interchanging of the terms perspective and theory, because um, that's really referring to the same thing. So sometimes we refer to theories as a perspective. Sometimes we just call them theories. And so they're both, it was really just referring to a way to systematic way to frame an issue or a problem. But the final will cover module week 10 through this week. And it is noted here, and it was also noted on that second slide of your PowerPoint, that rather than including 20 points, it will include 30 points. And this is because the um, the comprehensive quiz that you normally take at the end um, or by the end of each week that complements or covers the chapter or the portion of the chapter for the week is incorporated into the final. So 10 questions will specifically cover the last portion of chapter 8 that is assigned for this week. The other 20 questions, similar to the midterm, will be pulled from the comprehensive quizzes that you took beginning in week 10 through last week. And then there will be a few other questions that cover the bookend or supplementary material, uh, particularly that supplementary material. So, um, want to go through the work you submitted for each of those modules, look at my feedback, just refresh yourself on what was covered in each, where it looks like you uh, had things right, where it looks like maybe you needed more clarification, and just to again review some of those key concepts, perspectives that were introduced, like fair trade or the sociology of consumerism. Um, I also, like the last time, included 4 possible essay questions. 3 of these will be randomly selected for your individual and exam, and you will be able to choose the 2 that you write on and the number of points um, that you want allotted to it. So you will be able to choose which one you want to write for 30 points and which one you want to write for 40 points. I also included with this review some theories and concepts from each chapter. They don't necessarily include concepts introduced in the supplementary material. Many, like environmental racism or environmental justice or world systems theory or ecologically unequal exchange, were in your book, but also were in a supplementary source. So just take note of that. But you should be able to read through this and know what you need to know to be prepared for the exam. So I just again wanted to highlight a few concepts that were addressed um, since week 10, and it's actually starting with week 10. And the discussion for week in the discussion um, for week 10, I asked you which of the theories of population growth, um, which of the perspectives of population growth um, does the response of climate apartheid, which was that response that was discussed in the supplementary source that you had, that looked at the climate refugees, the climate migration from Central America, and in particular, but the and the climate apartheid response is the response of just batten down the hatches, shut down the borders, be as sort of it's a harsh approach. It's not one that certainly recognizes historical responsibility of a wealthy country like the United States, and a wealthy country like the United States has been one of the primary contributors to greenhouse gases, and it is considered a rather a harsh approach. But most of you noted that climate apartheid was most in line with the inequality perspective introduced in chapter 5 to explain the relationship between population growth and environmental and social problems. And I believe I commented back to all of you, if not most of you, that actually um, that is the best answer would be the neo-Malthusian approach. Now, I wanted to take a minute, and I said that I would eventually explain this to you. So this is what I'm doing now. Um, I believe that most of you put the inequality perspective because the climate apartheid approach seemed unfair, unjust, and one that was um, utilized by, um, you know, is utilized by countries with more power um, against those with less power, countries that have contributed more to the problem than the countries where people are migrating from. And so it seemed, I believe, unfair to people. It seemed possibly unjust. And it seemed like, which would be something the inequality perspective would point out, and that it would potentially lead to more, unequal relationships between countries and people. So, and that could certainly be an outcome of that approach. But that approach is actually most in line with so the climate apartheid approach is most in line with the neo Malthusian perspective. Neo Malthusians, um, one of the criticisms of that perspective is that they tend to take what some call draconian, meaning harsh, extreme um, uh, positions on issues associated with population growth and or population migration, and they interpret most environmental problems as stemming from uncontrolled population growth. So, they would see um, climate migration, climate refugees as a consequence of unchecked population growth. So they and the responses again that they tend to promote are responses that are oftentimes considered draconian. um, they've even been identified by some as racist, classist, because those, who tend to experience the negative effects of our social of our the negative effects of the environmental problems and social problems we are experiencing are those, who are most vulnerable in society because of inequalities that exist. So um, the neo-Malthusian perspective uh, would takes the position that while that approach, like climate apartheid, might seem harsh, it would be justifiable because the long term consequences of unchecked population growth are worse, famine, warfare, disease, massive disease. So they would argue that, possibly an approach like that would sort of force countries to get their population under control. And that would would lead to better outcomes for them as well as for everybody on the planet. So please review those perspectives, but that is the response that, or as a response, kind of apartheid as a response, would most align with that perspective. Now, as a response, the inequality that it actually produces, right, could definitely be addressed by the inequality perspective. So, an inequality response. So, what would that look like? An inequality response to, say, climate refugees might be, for example, um, taking climate injustice seriously, seriously addressing climate injustice. And to do so would mean addressing the historical responsibility of wealthy nations in the global north, in the core, if you're thinking about the world systems theory, taking responsibility and being leaders in mitigation efforts for climate change. So, mitigation, if you remember, as the effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? To reduce or eliminate greenhouse gas emissions is that it would be everything needed to get to a net zero carbon future, to decarbonize. Um, and that would mean, leading the way in their own countries, but also maybe providing technology transfers for mitigation to the global south, to countries, for example, in Central America or Bangladesh. Um, and also climate adaptation, so to address climate adaptation. So, how to so that would also include maybe technology transfers from the global north to the global south. It would include living up to, funding obligations that have been outlined, by the Conference of Parties when the United Nations, Framework Convention on Climate Change, when those folks get together yearly and agree to, funding these things to actually fund them, pay for them. But adaptation efforts might be to help these countries invest in early warning systems for disasters, to invest in technologies and infrastructures to help with food resiliency to uh, help manage or to take financing, rapidly urbanizing cities like Dhaka and in Bangladesh, right? So, and in Central America too, where you have people being pushed out of their um, homes, internally displaced, from oftentimes living in rural areas to rapidly urbanizing cities that do not have the capacity to absorb all those people at the rate in which they're coming. So that's going to take a lot of investment um, to help build the infrastructures to help those places if we don't want people moving to be able to stay there sustainably. So that's one of the things that that perspective would look at in terms of addressing climate refugees. Also, if you go up to like environmental justice, that was week 11, and in food issues, that's something to look at. The article environmental justice that you looked at environmental justice, the environmental justice framework, the theory behind environmental justice, as well as the environmental justice movement. In a global, through a global lens, and what that looks like in places outside of the global north, and particularly outside of the United States, reviewing world systems theory and ecologically unequal exchange. So uh, that I think people did a really good job, and I think seemed to like that article a lot, which was great. With sustainability, I really encourage you, and the question asks you, to think about what a sustainable future could look like, policies that could be pursued to bring it about. Um, but think about those side benefits, not just about the barriers, but the way in which a more sustainable future could help us live a better life, which really then was also part of or particularly part of week's 12 module, looking at the Happy Planet Index, but the sociology of consumerism. With the sociology of consumerism, to remind yourself that that the sociological perspective, the strength of the perspective is that it looks at how individuals um, operate within social structure and social systems. So, hold on a second. I'm going to pause this. I have a dog trying to get in. You people just keep leaving me alone. Come on, Archie. I'll just get him. I can't believe this. Well, Joe, you keep interrupting me. Your voice keeps coming in. Just go away, honey. Go away. Please go away. No, I have got him. Here. Give me your buddy. All right. So I hope that that actually paused the recording and not the just the share. But I had to pause because my little puppy was trying to get in the room. So again, with the sociology of consumerism is just to really think about how um, how we live our daily lives is much determined by the structures within our society. So, if we want to live sustainably, and in order to live sustainably, it needs to be convenient for us, something that we don't have to think about a whole lot. And, it needs to feel good to us. So, that gets at some of um, the issue of culture, right? And the culture of consumerism. And so Juliet Shore certainly addressed that in the video that you watched in my review, your reflection that you wrote about that video on the psychology and sociology of consumerism. Then, week 13 looked at greenwashing and plastics and recycling. And one of the um, striking, I think, aspects of the issue with plastic bottles is how plastics does relate to environmental injustice. And so, you know, uh, in some ways, you know, recycling and wish cycling is sort of an out of sight, out of mind approach to the problem that plastics present us. But the, realizing that there's not nearly enough plastic being recycled that could be, and not all plastics really are recyclable. But where does it go, right? And so recognizing that it's oftentimes dumped literally on the most vulnerable people around the globe, um, that when it's burned in incinerators, which populations live by those incinerators. And what we find is a pattern of environmental injustice, that it's generally the most vulnerable populations of people. So that, um, creates some direct harms and immediate harms to people. people who, have had who have contributed the least to the problem, and who generally don't get to be at the decision making table when it comes to deciding what sort of um, products we're going to produce. Like, is plastic something we even want to be making, let alone how to manage the externalities that they produce. But so they experience the most direct harms, that's for sure. But what environmental activists and thinkers try to get us and everybody else to recognize is that eventually these things harm everybody. And plastics, I think, are sadly a very good example of that people literally are eating plastic now. Like, if you're consuming fish from the oceans, right? You're eating plastics, right? So uh, that is, we're all in this together. And I think that's an important point of environmental justice, is to not that, no community should be a sacrifice zone. But when you protect the least amongst us, you protect all of us. And so that is a point that I wanted to, I guess, um, highlight. Uh, Review those policy fixes that I asked you to look at with plastics, like recycling plastics is a behavioral fix. Uh, a closed loop system would be a technological fix. It would be a legal fix if it was mandated by law that those are the only types of plastics that could be produced and consumed, were those in a closed loop system. Wish cycling is more of a cognitive fix. It's kind of that's it fits best with a cognitive fix, because it's a change in cognitive fix is really a change in your beliefs. So, like, I will start recycling because I now believe that it is important to do so. But or I might start conserving energy, or I'm walking more, whatever. But it's also not a fix at all, because you know it's just a wish. So that's a bit of the problem there. Um, with week 15, we looked at um, eco grief. And just a note with eco grief, um, I appreciated people's response to the video with Heidi. Now her last name, I'm blocking it, but I don't, I don't, I had mixed feelings myself about her use of that concept, and whether or not eco grief was a call to action. But after reading some of your posts, a couple things that I thought about was, that eco grief could actually lead to inaction, because sometimes our grief can immobilize us, right? So sometimes it's what you do with your grief, right? And often, what a lot of people are arguing, particularly looking at trauma today, and we're paying more attention to trauma that people experience, is rather than try to, shy away from it, or um, see it as too hard to address, too painful, that, you have to sort of take it on, look at it square in the face, um, that you have to allow yourself to feel that pain. Um, you have to allow yourself, in the case of grief, to go through, the stages of grief. And grief, has can be quite acute at certain stages, and it can be lifelong. but it's really about how you manage it. So, um, you know, if um, if it's not addressed, we certainly know, and in more psychological ways, that it can cause us a lot of trouble. You can think about that at the societal level. I thought of, with some of your responses, Carrie Norgard's concept of implicatory denial, the denial where that we looked at way back. We're looking at climate change and climate change in action, where people essentially recognize that there's a problem, but they don't act on it because by, you know, eh, really acting on it, they think that they will have to essentially feel bad, and they don't want to feel bad. They don't want to feel scared. So they avoid it. And that leads to inaction. And climate change certainly presents us with a big, sort of scary existential threat. So, but, um, by not acting on it, the concern, of course, is that things are going to get a whole lot worse, and rather rather than better. And that also, by acting on it, not only do we deal with the problem, but our life can actually be better. We can, in a sense, recover, if you kind of think about it in terms of that grief language. The other thing I thought about, and I just was going to point this out, and then I will come to a quick close, is how eco grief, might connect to um, the last portion of chapter 8, and what this portion that you're looking at in chapter 8 is anti-environmentalism. So, and what causes anti-environmentalism, and what are some of the effects of anti-environmentalism. But one thing to think about is, because your last question, possible essay question, question number 4, asks you to think about, what do you see, for the future of environmentalism nationally and globally, and just remind yourself of how hard anti-environmentalist forces have to work to really um, create denial, create skepticism, create anti-environmentalism, green scamming, astroturf campaigns, which are addressed in this portion of the chapter. Um, these various forms of manipulation, how they uh, really, you know, um, take a lot of uh, collective organization and effort to try to keep us from maybe grieving, maybe having that ego grief, and then actually doing something about it, being resilient. Um, and so uh, this made me think about reflexive modernization theory, which is addressed in this portion of the chapter, pages 347, 348. And basically, short story is that reflexive modernization theorists argue that the time period, um, if you categorize where we're at as a society, um, the United States and country, and really the world system, which um, both the United States, for example, and the world system are structured, or heavily influenced by the structure of our economic system of capitalism, and that we are in the late capitalist phase, right? So when Karl Marx, for example, was writing, that was, he was describing what scholars now refer to as early capitalism. Well, now scholars say we're in the late capitalist phase. And what scholars have noted is that Late capitalism is producing what some call legitimacy crisis, meaning it's getting harder and harder for people to believe in this system, right? And to accept, because if any system, there's no utopia out there, right? With any system, they're going to have some goods and the bads, right? But to really accept the trade offs of capitalism, right? Um, and that, again, to believe in those trade offs, like like the idea, for example, addressed in chapter 7, that you have to sacrifice to some degree the environment for economic um, prosperity, advancement, well being is really a false trade off, right? The evidence shows that you don't have to do that. And in fact, efforts to protect the environment actually lead to better outcomes for people and for societies. We can review that in chapter 7 under the politics and policy. But with this theory, the reflexive modernization, the legitimacy crisis is that because of the extremely powerful technology of industrial capitalism, um, this system, which has been fueled by fossil fuels, we are at the point of some turning points, some tipping points, right? That we're facing, um, what some call a climate crisis, the potential for runaway climate change. We've created weapons of mass destruction that can literally destroy this planet several times over. Um, so the treadmill of destruction discussed in chapter 6. And that the promise of a decent life for most people, a middle class life, is not that easily attainable for most people anymore. Inequality is growing between the rich and the poor. The middle class is feeling insecure, very insecure. Um, the old breadwinner homemaker model, or just to be able to, support a family on one income. Very few people can do that anymore, like in the United States. So, um, how is this then understood? This sort of, and the notion behind this perspective is that these problems are created by the system, itself. So a reflexive reaction, the notion is that that's when you sort of look at it all square in the face. You're able to critically examine it, not in a cynical way where you become hopeless and feel helpless, but in a critical way where you're able to take in information. You look at the science, that they have, the best knowledge that we have, um, to understand what it is we're confronting, and then to try to, figure out, how we can best move forward. Um, so, accepting and taking all that in, and then embracing social movements, because social movements, through their collective mobilization of people, um, and which, most of the people you've listened to this semester or watch, when they've been asked, all of them, in fact, when they've been asked, um, how can we resolve, this environmental problem, say like climate change? Is it individual action or collective action? They all say it's collective action, meaning we need people to act together to transform, right? Systems, these systems, and so these structures of our society. Um, so social movements help to collectively mobilize people to create the structural change, but also, the cultural change that needs to happen, the change in beliefs, right? Or the other response is anti-reflexivity, where rather than embracing uh, the need for change to resist it, to sort of deny the problems that we are, to deny these problems, environmental and social, or deny the source is the result of the systems, our society itself, and the systems that make it up, the structures that make it up, um, to try to defend the status quo, even if the status quo harms you. So that's one of the points that, a lot of the authors and, the readings, the people that you've been introduced to this semester, again, try to point out, um, that by addressing environmental problems, it doesn't have to be seen as giving something up, but as actually rather gaining something, living a better life, um, reducing the harm that you may be experiencing knowingly or unknowingly, or could experience. So, anyhow, that is what I wanted to emphasize with that. I can get a little passionate on these things and go on a little possibly longer than you want me to. So, but the beauty of doing the recording is you can turn me off whenever you want. Um, the other thing to review, I don't know if it's necessarily clarified on the um, review page, which is do think about the state, government, political structures as well, how they play a role. Um, and I guess that is actually addressed with question number three. But none of these topics that are covered in any of the modules or been covered throughout the semester, are isolated from the other. So you can always bring in concepts, theories, information, facts, evidence that are relevant, to one question, and bring those in while addressing another question. So I'm going to stop the share and say goodbye to you. If you have any questions as you're reviewing material, as you're getting ready to wrap this all up, certainly let me know. Again, it's been a pleasure having you in class. I hope some of this helped a little bit. And um, please take good care of yourself. Bye bye.